Ladies and gentlemen, let's read GameIntent.com video. We have news concerning the Xbox One and overheating. Microsoft have been very keen to avoid the PR disaster of the Xbox 360's RROD, of course Red Ring of Death. Since then, the general manager of console development, Leo Del Castello, was speaking in an interview and reassuring any and all who would listen that the Xbox One is going to be a very cool running console, and in fact they have even thought about things such as if people blocked the air vents deliberately or by accident, playing on very extended periods of time, and a lot more stuff besides. So we're going to go over that real quick in this interview and of course do some analysis of it as well. Now, in an interview with Gizmodo, Del Castello said, and I quote, "We can't prevent misuse of a product, but we can certainly anticipate it. One thing we have a little bit more flexibility with the architecture on Xbox One is that we can actually dial back on the power of the box considerably. We had a little less flexibility with the 360, and basically, if we couldn't dissipate the heat, there wasn't a whole lot of leverage we could pull to keep the heat from being generated, so we had a limited amount of time before it just shut down. Xbox One can actually dial back to a low power state, so low in fact that it can be in this mode that uses virtually no airflow. I don't know the exact details of how it will show up to the user, but we try to be as transparent to the user as possible. We'll allow the fans to go all the way up to the maximum speed. They might even notice a little bit of extra noise, and that would help to self-correct the condition." So, out of quote for a moment, we do remember with the Xbox 360, of course, the problem with the RROD, and we're just going to cover it real quick, we're not going to go too much in depth, of course, was that the system literally was cooking itself. So, obviously the system got so bloody hot, it damaged its own internals. We all know the story, and Microsoft got somewhat blasted in the press. Now, one of the reasons behind this was the CPU and GPU were very power hungry and output a lot of heat in a fairly enclosed environment, thanks at the time, of course, to a large manufacturing die as well. Of course, this shrank over time, which reduced not only the power requirements of the CPU/GPU, in fact they eventually amalgamated them onto the same die anyway. But in addition to all of that, and somewhat worse of course, there was the problems with the cooling methods inside the Xbox 360. But we know the Xbox One hasn't been like that, and indeed, Microsoft in a previous interview have said that they actually anticipate the Xbox One to always be on. In other words, it's been designed to be on for, I believe, a period of 10 years, consistently. So in other words, you never have to turn it off. That's not to say you can't, of course, but they have designed it with this in mind. And so, if a user does something silly, like, for example, blocks an air vent, if a user does something like, I don't know, lives in the Sahara Desert and turns on the console and starts playing for a 12-hour session, in theory, and once again this is all theoretical, the system will be able to detect its temperature. Now, this goes from a series of other reports that we have spoke about very briefly previously, where it goes to the development kits, and we remember that the development kits had various reports going that they were ramping up too high in fans, and that led to a series of reports saying that the early versions of the Xbox One were extremely noisy. Since then, of course, we've learned that this wasn't the case, and they merely didn't have the control software in place at the time to control the fan speed, so all they simply did, the developers, were ramp the speed up to the absolute maximum possible to prevent overheating as a safety precaution rather than anything else, to be honest. And so, in another quote, "The way we design the box, we don't actually ever intend it to go up to the maximum speed under normal environmental conditions. But there is an overhead, so we'll allow the fan to go all the way up to maximum speed, and if that solves the problem without the user having to do anything." Now, it also mentions, out of quote, that the Xbox One has the ability, as we've mentioned previously just a few moments ago, to thermal regulate. In other words, the architecture itself can increase or decrease in clock speed. Now, we know that the PC, for example, is a very good point of reference to this. Assuming you have a relatively modern PC and you've got the features enabled, you can, for the most part, disable them under the motherboard. Most CPUs now can decrease or increase their frequencies. Now, this is two parts. One, to reduce the power usage, and two, for heat-related issues as well. So in short, let's say for example your CPU is 3 GHz and it's not really doing anything at the time. What will simply happen is the CPU will reduce in speed to a predefined number. We'll just arbitrarily say 1.5 GHz just to make it easy. And the similar type of thing will also happen, for example, if the CPU starts to get very hot. And or this is also applicable for other components inside your system, most noticeably the graphics card. And so what you'll start noticing a lot of the time is, let's say for example you're one of those people who overclock the graphics card, or even if you keep it stock but your room is really hot, or the airflow in your case is really bad, whatever. You'll notice that the actual clock speed, if you were to keep a monitor of the GPU clock, and for that matter the memory clock of your GPU, the graphics card, you'll notice that it actually starts to lower in speed. So let's once again use an arbitrary number. Let's say the GPU clock speed is 600 megahertz, just to throw one out there. And let's say, for example, the fan ramps up to a certain speed, let's say 100%, and it feels, okay, this isn't working, my temperature is still getting a bit too hot for me, this isn't good, I'm going to decrease the voltage that's being put to the GPU, and in addition to that, I'm going to also lower the maximum clock speed, because voltage and clock speed are one and the same. There's actually the higher the voltage that goes into the GPU or the part, the higher the clock speed can go up to a point. But there's also this point where, in most parts anyway, where you can actually increase the voltage, but you won't get equal increase in clock speed. I'm just going to give a really quick example for this, and this is by no means accurate. But I don't want to make this video too complicated because I just wanted to basically report on the news, but I just want to give you guys an idea of what I'm talking about, since I touched on the subject anyway. Let's say, for example, you have a GPU that's 1 gigahertz, and let's say, for example, we're just going to use simple numbers. So let's say, for example, that uses 1 volt. Now, let's say you want to overclock your GPU to 1.1 gigahertz. You might be able to get to 1050 megahertz with no voltage increase at all. Then you might be able to get to, say, 1.1 volts to get to 1.1. Now, obviously this isn't exact, and by no means is it usually this 1-to-1 ratio, but once again we're just using this as an example. So let's say 1.1 gigahertz and 1.1 volts. Great. Now you decide, well, you know what, it's fine, I'm not having any heat issues really, I want to be greedy, I want to push this to 1.2 gigahertz. What might happen is you push it up a couple of megahertz and then you notice, okay, I need more voltage because it's not being stable, but my temperatures are still fine. And so what you do is you ramp up the voltage and then you put it from, say, 1.1 volts to 1.2. And you would expect the correlation you had previously to be the same. So in other words, you would expect that the 1.2 volts would get you 1.2 gigahertz. And you start ramping it up, and then you do a test at like 1200 megahertz, so 1.2 gigahertz, and it doesn't work. And then you try it at 1150 megahertz, and it does work. And then what you could do, if you felt really, brave and silly, you could actually push the voltage up to like 1.3, and that might give you the 1.2 gigahertz. And in other words, the extra amount of power that's required is not necessarily going to correlate to the amount of speed you get down the line. So in other words, it starts to get worse and worse and worse. In other words, what you get out of it is not necessarily what you would get out of it earlier on. And this is why I've been saying for a while now that I probably should have given this example in a couple of videos earlier, to be honest. But this is one of the reasons that I've been saying for a while that to increase the Jaguar's CPU clock speed, which of course is 1.6 gigahertz, most likely for the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, if they wanted to increase that to, say, 2 gigahertz, it would actually increase the power, the TDP by 66%, which is pretty damn high, is what it comes down to. You can imagine just how profound that is of a difference, and that's just what I'm saying. So yeah, hopefully that's made some sense, but as I said, just to reiterate, the Xbox One has been designed to be a very cool console. It's been designed to, at least theoretically for the most part, be pretty much silent and to keep tabs of its own hardware to a much greater degree, and that's very good. Obviously, this is one of the benefits of the Jaguar architecture as a whole. It has the ability to very easily thermal regulate itself. And not just thermal regulate itself, it has the ability to lower its clock speed, lower its power requirements, and so forth and so forth. Anyway, this has been a fairly reasonable video, I think. I think I've covered everything I needed to, so if you've got any questions, you can, of course, contact me directly. That would be facebook.com/redgamingtech, and I will answer you. As I said, I don't usually typically answer messages on YouTube, because most of my messages turn out to be spam on YouTube, I'll just be honest. And I don't really read inbox on YouTube. It's just bad, the amount of crap that we get in. I'm not talking about from viewers, I'm just talking about like spam emails. It's just sad, you know. It's kind of like if you made a Hotmail account and then you put that Hotmail account and you just advertised it on like a forum because, you know, you forgot to take off the address and you wanted someone to email you, and then you left it for like 3 months, and you know what happens to the spam. It's kind of like what you get on YouTube, unfortunately. So, well, at least on my YouTube. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.